Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The energy hum reverberated through the metallic walls of the lab. Tony adjusted his glasses, his eyes locked on the temporal rift generator, which hummed like a beast waking from slumber. It had taken years, decades, really, of research to reach this moment. Tony, a brilliant physicist specializing in the intricate laws of time and space, stood at the edge of making history. Next to him was Clark, a man cut from a different cloth entirely. Where Tony was all theories and calculations, Clark was action, a military strategist who had seen combat in the most hostile environments on Earth and beyond. Clark, arms crossed, surveyed the equipment. So what's the worst that could happen? Tony didn't answer right away, eyes glued to the console in front of him. Well, theoretically, we could be vaporized into nothingness. Clark chuckled, though the tension in the air was palpable, comforting. The generator's sound grew louder. Tony's hands danced across the controls, entering the final sequences. The lights in the lab dimmed and the energy in the room shifted, almost as if reality itself had grown heavier. Ready? Asked. Clark adjusted the strap on his tactical vest, making sure his equipment was secure, as ready as I'll ever be. The final switch was thrown, and for a moment, the world held its breath. The air rippled like water, and then everything exploded into light. Tony had been prepared for the theoretical consequences, but nothing could have braced him for what followed. He felt the ground shift beneath him as if reality itself had been pulled apart at the seam. When the light faded, Tony and Clark were no longer standing in the sterile confines of their lab. Instead, they found themselves in a vast open field. The sky above was a deep, cloudless blue, and in the distance, the silhouettes of mountains cut through the horizon. The soft breeze carried the scent of earth and something else, something ancient. Clark was the first to react, dropping into a defensive stance, his hand instinctively moving toward the sidearm strapped to his belt. Trike, where the hell are we? Tony staggered to his feet, still reeling from the disorienting shift. I don't know. He turned in a slow circle, taking in the unfamiliar landscape. This isn't here, right? We were supposed to be observing the past. Yeah, well, we ran it now, Clark muttered, scanning the area. Any idea when this is? Tony's standing mind raced, running through calculations. The trees in the distance looked different, ancient in a way he couldn't quite place. And then it hit him, the overwhelming realization of what they'd done. We were in the past, he said, his voice barely a whisper. No kidding, Clark replied, still scanning the horizon. The question is, how far back? Tony crouched down, running his hand through the dirt as if the soil could offer him some answer. He glanced back at the generator, now sparking and smoking beside them. The device that had torn them through time was broken, and without it they were stranded. We were not just observers, Tony said, standing slowly. So we just actually traveled back. Clark's eyes narrowed. And how exactly do we get back to where we belong? I don't know, Tony admitted, his heart sinking. The generator's busted. We do need to find a way to repair it, but I don't know if we have the resources here. Before Clark could respond, the sound of distant footsteps echoed across the field. The two men turned, spotting a group of figures approaching from the tree line. They moved with purpose, and even from this distance, it was clear they were armed. We've got company, Clark said, his hand tightening around his sidearm. What sense the play? Tony's mind raced. We need to blend in. We can't let anyone know we're viewing from the future. Anything we do here could alter history in ways we can't even imagine. Clark grunted, fine, but if it comes to a fight, I am not going down without a scrap. The figures grew closer, and it became apparent. They were soldiers, Roman soldiers, if the armor and weapons were any indication. Tony's stomach twisted. They weren't just in the past. They were in an era of ancient war. The leader of the soldiers, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his face, barked an order in Latin. Tony's mind racing barely caught enough of the language to understand. The soldier demanded to know who they were and where they had come from. Tony's response was quick, though. His Latin was rusty. We are travelers, lost? The soldier eyed them both suspiciously, his gaze lingering on Clark's futuristic gear. Clark, who understood none of the exchange, kept his hand hovering near his weapon, ready to react at a moment. Side noted. Another sharp command, and the soldiers surrounded them. Clark tensed his military instincts, screaming to take action, but Tony shot him a look that said, not yet. The soldiers motioned for them to follow, and with no other option, they did. They were led to a nearby Roman encampment, the scale of which made it clear this was a legion on the march. Tents stretched as far as the eye could see, and the sound of hammering drilling and soldiers' chatter filled the air. They were escorted into a large tent where the commander Marcellus awaited. Marcellus, a war-hardened veteran, eyed Tony and Clark with suspicion. He spoke in a low, gravelly voice, demanding answer. Tony translated as best he could. He wants to know why we reach here. Clark glanced around the room. Tell him we reach just passing through. Tony shot him a look but relayed a modified version of the message. Marcellus didn't seem satisfied, his gaze drifting to the strange devices Clark carried. Marcellus leaned forward. You carry things I have never seen. What magic do you possess? Tony hesitated, unsure of how to respond before he could speak. One of the soldiers entered the tent, holding what looked like a piece of the damaged temporal generator. His heart sank. They were already drawing too much attention. We need to leave, Tony whispered to Clark. Clark nodded. I've been thinking the same thing. This guy's trouble. Marcellus stood, his towering frame casting a shadow over them. You will stay and explain yourselves. There's much I would learn from men who wield such power. Tony's pulse quickened. They were trapped, and every second they stayed here risked altering the future. But escaping would be easy, not with the full legion of soldiers surrounding them. We don't have a choice, Tony muttered. We need to get out of here now. Clark said, hand dropped to his sidearm. I've got your back, just say the word. But before Tony could respond, chaos erupted outside the tent. Shouts and the clash of steel rang out as soldiers scrambled to defend the camp. Marcellus turned, barking orders to his men. This is our chance, Tony whispered. They slipped out of the tent amidst the confusion, blending into the chaos as the Roman soldiers fought off an ambush from a rival tribe. Clark's combat instincts took over as he led Tony through the chaos, dodging arrows and sword strikes. They made it to the edge of the camp, panting as the sounds of battle faded into the distance. But as they stood there, catching their breath, Tony couldn't shake the feeling that something had already changed. Every action they took here, every interaction, was causing ripples in the timeline. And the worst part, they hadn't just even begun to understand the full consequences of those changes. Tony and Clark moved swiftly through the dense forest, the sounds of the Roman camp fading behind them. The night air was thick with the scent of pine and damper. Tony's mind raced, not just from the adrenaline, but from the growing realization that they were more entangled with this time period than they'd ever intended to be. Clark stopped, motioning for Tony to crouch behind a large tree. They could hear the distant sounds of soldiers shouting orders as the Roman camp attempted to fend off the attacker. The chaos had given them the perfect cover to escape, but the uncertainty of their next move weighed heavily on both of them. We can keep running, Clark whispered, eyes scanning the darkness. Sooner or later, they were going to catch on that we're not from around here. Tony rubbed his temples, his head pounding from the effort of trying to solve their predicament. We need time to figure out how to repair the generator, or at least find materials to do so. But every second we stay here, we risk doing irreparable damage to the timeline. Clark nodded, but his focus remained on their immediate surrounding. How far off do you think we are from finding those materials? Tony grimaced. That's not the problem. We were in ancient times. Nothing here is advanced enough for what we need. We might have to improvise a lot. Clark glanced back toward the Roman camp, his jaw tight. Hyreal managed. We've been through worse. Tony wasn't so sure. The complexity of time travel, the delicate fabric of history, and the pressure to avoid catastrophic changes were weighing on him. But they had no choice but to keep moving forward. We should head east, Erie, Tony finally said. The materials we might need, metals, possibly rare minerals, could be found in the mountains. It's our best shot. Clark nodded. Lead the way. They set off again, moving quietly through the night. The further they distanced themselves from the camp, the quieter the world became, with only the occasional rustle of animals and the underbrush and the whisper of the wind through the trees. Hours passed, and the moon at pale light guided them as they climbed the foothills toward the looming mountain. Tony's mind continued to race, calculating possible outcomes. He knew Clark trusted him, but trust didn't erase the growing fear gnawing at his gut. Time was slipping through their fingers, and each misstep could alter the course of history. He had to stay focused, had to find a way to fix this before it was too late. By the time they reached a small clearing at the base of the mountains, the first hints of dawn were streaking the sky. Exhausted, they found shelter in a small cave and collapsed onto the ground. Tony's muscles ached, his body yearning for rest, but his mind wouldn't stop turning over the endless possibilities and dangers that lay ahead. Clark leaned back against the cave wall, his expression hard but thoughtful. "We need a plan, a real one, not just moving from one crisis to the next." Tony nodded, pulling his knees to his chest. "Are you right? First, we need to figure out exactly what caused the malfunction in the generator. Once we know that we can work on finding materials to fix it. And if we can," Tar Clark's voice was calm, but the question was loaded. "If we can," Tony hesitated, knowing the weight of the answer. "Then we're stuck here, and everything we do, every single thing, will ripple forward through time." Clark stared out of the cave entrance, watching the first light of day inch across the landscape. "Craig will find a way, we always do." Despite the exhaustion tugging at him, Tony couldn't rest. He pulled the remnants of the damaged generator from his pack, examining the scorched wires and cracked component. It was a mess, but there was still hope. If they could find the right materials, maybe they had a chance. Hours passed in silence as Tony worked, and Clark kept watch. But just as Tony started to feel like they might have a shot, Clark saw a voice cut through the stillness. "We got company." Tony looked up to see a small group of men approaching from the tree line. They were dressed in simple, rough clothing, armed with spears and bow. At first glance, they didn't seem to be Roman soldiers, but their presence still set Tony on edge. Clark stepped forward, one hand resting on his holster, though he didn't draw his weapon. The leader of the group stepped forward, a man with dark hair and a hardened face. He spoke in the same language Tony had heard from the Romans, though his accent was different, perhaps local, tribal. Tony translated quickly in his head. The man asked who they were and why they were here. "Weary travelers," carefully keeping his tone neutral. "We mean no harm." The man's eyes narrowed, but he didn't seem hostile, at least not yet. He glanced at their gear, clearly suspicious, but not ready to attack. "Travelers from where?" the man asked. Tony hesitated. "From far away." The man studied them for a moment, then gestured for his men to lower their weapons. "There's a village nearby. You'll come with us. It's not safe here." Clark and Tony exchanged a glance. They didn't have much choice. Refusing could make them enemies, and they couldn't afford to fight off an entire tribe. "Lead the way," Clark said. The group escorted them through the forest, moving swiftly but cautiously. Tony could feel the tension radiating from Clark, but they followed in silence. The village was small, nestled between the mountains and the forest, a collection of huts made from wood and stone. It seemed peaceful enough, but Tony knew better than to assume anything in this world was safe. They were brought to the village elder, an older woman with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through them. She studied Tony and Clark for a long moment before speaking. "You're not from here," she said, her voice firm. "Not from this land, not from this time." Tony's breath caught in his throat. "How do you mean?" The elder's gaze was piercing. "The air around you is different. You carry the scent of a world that does not exist yet." Clark tensed, but Tony shook his head, signaling him to stay calm. "We were not here to harm anyone. However, he said carefully, you were just trying to find our way back." The elder nodded slowly. "You have crossed a boundary few have dared to breathe. Time is a delicate thing. Your presence here, is dangerous." Tony, his heart sank. The elder smiled faintly. "The balance of the world can be easily shifted by those who do not belong." Clark stepped forward. "Then help us. We need materials to repair something that will get us out of here." The elder studied them both for a moment longer, then sighed. "I will help you, but know this. Every action you take from here will ripple forward. You cannot undo what has already been set in motion." Tony nodded, his throat tight. He understood the gravity of her words, but they had no choice. They couldn't just stay here and risk further damage to the timeline. The elder gestured to one of the men standing nearby. "Take them to the caves. They may find what they seek there." The man nodded and led Tony and Clark out of the village. As they walked, Tony's mind was a whirlwind of calculations and fear. The elder's warning echoed in his head. Every action, every step they took could change everything. But as they approached the caves, Tony knew they were running out of time in more ways than one. His future, their world was slipping further and further away with every passing second.